So good morning, everyone. Once again, I'm BodieFletcher, and I'm a crop and soil major, focusing in the genetics and breeding. So today I hope to remove some of the mystery and smoke screens surrounding genetically modified organisms, specifically crops. So genetic modification has been going on since the birth of agriculture more than 12,000 years ago. So in order to distinguish between conventional breeding methods and then the genetic modification, the FDA refers to it as genetic engineering. So on the left you can see a diagram depicting conventional breeding. And so what they would do is they would cross two plants with the hopes of getting a single gene. And they'd have to work at it for several generations to narrow it down to that single gene they were after, whether that was drought resistance or a higher yield or larger seeds. And with the technology we have today, we can single out the one gene we want to focus on, cutting down on time, effort. We can do it in one generation. So the first process is to select the gene that you wish to have. So in your little baggies, we'll go back to kindergarten for a moment, you should have several circles of different colors. And on these I've written different characteristics or qualities you could look for in a gene. So you've got drought resistance, resistant to disease. You might want them to be poisonous to a certain insect so they will avoid them. So and then these single strands of the same color, this is the DNA from the crop you want to alter. So what you would do is you would select a gene from the bag, and I pulled out drought resistance. So what you want to do is you want to insert this into the DNA sequence of the crop you wish to alter, say it's corn. So in labs they use transferring tools, whether it's a needle as shown, or there's this gene gun, which I'll get to in a moment, but for now it's going to be your fingers. So you've got the DNA sequence, again, say of the corn. And what you want to do is you want it to be inserted somewhere in the gene structure. So again, what they do is they'll take the selected gene and they'll either pierce the cell membrane with a needle and insert it into the nucleus and hope that it takes into the DNA sequence. Or Monsanto usually uses a gene gun in which they literally fire the genes at a piece of plant tissue in hopes that it will enter the cell and take. So the next step is to create a tissue culture. And so what they'll do is they'll take the cell with the modified DNA and they place this on plant tissue of, again, the crop, say corn. And that could be a leaf, stem, etc. And they'll leave this to mature in hopes that the cells will begin to reproduce, carrying the DNA and the modification with them. And then once the culture has matured, they then move it to a media, which is usually a piece of paper or another petri dish, that contains all the necessary nutrients for a plant to thrive. So here again you can see the process of the gene insertion, the cell culture that's being allowed to mature, and of course that's hopefully the final product. So once it's been placed on the media, they wait for the plantlet to grow, which is going to be just a miniature version starting to show plant-like characteristics, whether it's green or a root system begins to form or leaves. And once the root system is stable enough, they will transfer it into a pot with soil, or they will transfer it to a test tube containing further nutrients for more growth. Now, once it has gotten to a good size, they will take a sample of the plant tissue from this new plant and test it to make sure that the modification took in the DNA. And if it has, they then send it through many tests through the FDA and other health agencies to make sure that it's safe for human consumption or other uses. And then once they do that, they can collect the pollen, collect the seeds from these plants, and use them to create enough to, in Monsanto's case, sell seeds to farmers or for other uses. So here's a diagram just depicting the entire process from your gene selection to the transfer of it into the DNA sequence, your plantlet, and then hopefully the final product with the modification. So GMOs, of course, have been in the news a lot lately, and I'm sure you all have heard a lot of the negatives that could come with it. And most of these surround possible health risks because we are messing with DNA sequences. We don't know how that's going to affect our digestion or other issues. Another one, especially for scientists, is a loss of natural diversity. So here you have one plant that's producing more, that does better in the conditions. More farmers are going to go for that. So then you lose the natural, say, wheat crops that have been used for generations. And then if a disaster does strike, one that these new plants are not able to account for, everything's wiped out. However, they can once again go back to the lab, create new crops to counter what's happened. And then there's also a fear that pollen from these new crops is going to interact and breed with surrounding weeds. And the fear is then that, say you have one that you've made resistant to pesticides or other harmful chemicals, now you have a harder time killing these weeds surrounding. So there's a fear that it's going to spread, it's going to get out of control. However, there are many pros that come with GMOs, especially in the crops. First of all, population is ever growing. We need to find a way to meet food demands. And so this way we can produce crops that, say, have a longer growing, or a longer harvest period, or ones with increased yield, ones that do better in our climate conditions that we're having now. And another reason is that possible health benefits from these, especially with the crops. They have been working to insert more nutritional values into the crops. So in countries where food is not as readily available, they can get more nutritional benefit from the food that they have. And this is technology. It's been around for 40 years. People have been doing it this way. And genetically modified crops have been in our food source for over 20 years in the U.S. with little documented health risks to them. But of course, there's always the unknown, and they put new crops through very specific tests when they come. So I hope I've removed some of the mystery around this process that's in the news, and are there any questions? Okay? Yes?
I'm not that familiar with biology, but have weeds actually reproduced with, I guess, modified crops?
I don't think they have yet, or they haven't had enough evidence to back it up. The only difference between a weed and a crop is that the crop is desirable in our eyes. That's the only difference. And so plants do readily mutate. It's something they just do naturally. While animals only have 2 sets of chromosomes, plants can have 3, 4, 5, 6. They thrive off of mutations. So our wheat has 6 sets of chromosomes. So they more readily can crossbreed and reproduce. So I don't think there's enough evidence to really back up this yet, but there's definitely the theories and the science to prove that it could be a problem. Any others? Okay, thank you very much.
What about with the Roundup resistant ones? Like, I think of it like the fact that you're making it Roundup resistant means you're going to spray it with Roundup.
Right.
So what that says to me is the plant is able to take that within its roots and not die.
Right.
But at the same time, it still went through the roots.
Mm-hmm.
And then it has to go into our stomachs. So
right.
How do you think that affects the plant or us?
I don't think it's good for him to be absorbing the chemicals. I'm all for the genetic modification to make them more resistant to diseases and be able to thrive with the weeds around them so that we don't have to resort to as many chemicals.